Hi everyone. For a while now, Aarti and I have been discussing about putting out some content about how to cope with grief. None of us are strangers to grief. I had an original idea of putting out a book, which I think I still will, where I chronicle my journey after the loss of my parents, and this happened in quick succession. When that happened, it shook my world. It made me reevaluate my priorities and redefine my relationships. But I've grieved before. Every time I had to give up something, someone, with every heartbreak. Every time I lost my health or peace of mind. The list is quite long, and I'm sure you'll agree that you, as I am, are familiar with what I'm talking about.
Grief is a reaction to any kind of loss. We are most familiar with the kind of grief associated with the loss of a loved one, which is often referred to as bereavement. However, I could grieve the loss of a job. I could grieve when my family or a close friend is very unwell. I could grieve the loss of a pet. As a parent, I could grieve because my adult children no longer come to me for protection or advice. I could grieve because though I may be promoted and in a better space at work, my contribution is no longer valued by my subordinates. I could grieve because I was in hostel for 14 years and I grew up with this family of friends that I can no longer be with. I could also, in uncertain times like a pandemic, grieve without any clarity because everything overwhelms me. In short, grief is a reaction to a loss, sometimes a perceived loss, of a person, a position, or a possession. Grief is not one emotion. And it's not only sadness like a lot of people believe. Grief encompasses a range of emotions, sometimes anger, sometimes remorse, sometimes regret, guilt too, and many people experience fear and anxiety as part of the grief reaction along with helplessness.
And the grief that we are all facing in this pandemic that no one has ever experienced before, not in this scale, not for this duration. This pandemic which has affected the world, nations, economies, people and relationships. Aarti has spoken to counselors and therapists across the globe, and they have made a list of the different types of grief that they, and Aarti as well, have worked with. There are many types of grief, and we would like to share some of those with you.
Since grief is a natural aspect of being human, in the sense that we will all experience some form of loss at some point in our life, it may become very difficult for us to identify grief at a particular point in our life. For example, there are people who shift into the city with a new job, with a huge hike in pay, but may not really be happy there because they grieve the loss of friends in a smaller town or the quality of the relationships that they experienced in a smaller town. And this is where it's important for us to understand that the types of grief that we are sharing with you today are not fixed boxes or diagnostic tools, but rather a small framework within which you may be able to identify if you're grieving or if a loved one is going through some form of grief. This is where I'd like you to understand that the segment today is specifically designed to help us cope with grief in the most gentle process possible. Anu is going to help me with this.
What we refer to as normal grief is something that we feel as a result of a trigger, a loss of a person, a job, maybe the loss of health, or maybe the struggle with post-COVID recovery and so on. But some people feel grief even before the actual loss happens.
That type of grief is referred to as anticipatory grief, and we experience it when a loved one is very ill or has received a diagnosis of a terminal illness. Many people who have your loved ones in the ICU during this COVID crisis also experience a lot of anticipatory grief because you don't know what the outcome is or will be. My parents, both of them, moved on after prolonged illnesses that did not have a specific treatment. At most, the symptoms could be alleviated and a little bit of relief could be given to them. At that point, my grief, my anticipatory grief, would be silent tears at their bedside on certain days, extreme anger and helplessness on other days. Then there would be days where I would feel that it would be better if they moved on and did not have to suffer or struggle so much, and then it would immediately move to guilt because I didn't want to feel that way. When my mother passed away after the prolonged illness, I was initially very relieved because she was no longer struggling, but it quickly became guilt and a lot of other emotions that I'd suppressed. That's when I realized, and technically also we tell people, that you cannot pick and choose what emotions you can suppress and what you can feel. So when you suppress sadness, you also suppress joy, which is why the grief process is so important for us to go through every emotion one at a time. When my father passed away, that was much earlier, and so everybody told me, you have to be strong for your mother, don't break down, don't fall into sadness and things like that. So I held on to being really tough. I put on this huge front and I was suppressing a lot of emotions. But what I experienced after several years of my father's death was what was called delayed grief, and it came when my school that I was running for 14 years had to be closed for many reasons. What was happening was that I was experiencing extreme grief, though I was moving on to a better space in terms of my work. That's when I realized that I was actually finally grieving the death of my father. That kind of grief is usually called delayed grief. And what also happened at the same time is that my emotional reactions were very exaggerated, and that exaggeration or out of control emotional experience sometimes is referred to as exaggerated grief.
That is such a hard journey that we all have to make, isn't it? And the journey is different for different people, and we come out with different lessons and different experiences. But the loss of a parent is something that is at least identified. But there are many times when the loss and the grief that accompanies it shows up in different ways. Aarti and I were discussing about a friend who lost his brother. He was very close to his brother, and until the time he had lost his brother, he was focused on being, fit and exercise. But when he lost his brother, he started drinking, and eventually he became addicted to alcohol. This is something that I think we can call masked grief. In another situation, there was someone who was in a very, very powerful position, but their job was taken away from them, and they were made to report to people who used to report to them before. Now, this causes a lot of stress and frustration and unhappiness as well. But this person never spoke about it. He just suppressed it, and it started affecting him physically, and he developed hypertension. This could be called inhibited grief. And then there is distorted grief. When something bad happens, the behavior that changes is something that we don't relate to. So Aarti was telling me about this person whose business partner cheated them and left behind huge debts. So this person had to deal with those debts, start over again. So there was a lot of frustration, anger and sadness, and all of this came out as aggression. And eventually this person became aggressive towards his family and kids. That is something that can be called distorted grief.
They seem similar, but in masked grief, physical changes and behavioral changes take the place of the emotions. In inhibited grief, the lack of emotional expression becomes a physical illness over a period of time. And in distorted grief, one specific emotion like anger takes the form of aggression or abuse towards a loved one and replaces the whole complex gamut of emotions that a person has to experience or has to go through during the grieving process.
As you listen to the types of grief that we speak about, some of you might resonate with it because you may have experienced it, or you may know someone who has experienced it. But there are some forms of grief that impair a person's ability to function. Many of us, when we experience grief, we go through it and then we bounce back to our normal life, and we are even able to think back fondly of the person we have lost or that thing which we have lost. But that's not the case with some people who struggle throughout their life.
Grief is a lifelong process, so we don't actually rush to fix or to treat grief. We learn to move on in spite of the grief. This is where, in the process, we may experience emotions and behaviors, sometimes thoughts, which are distressing and then could be soothing, and we may come back to the distressing thoughts. Some days we may experience mild challenges. Some days are severely challenging. There may be days we feel a lot of regret and remorse associated with the loss, and then there may be days that we experience relief. This is why grief is so confusing for a lot of people to process. And it's also even more important for us to understand, because of the nature of the grieving process, we can't fix it into boxes or categories, processes or quick fix. We need to realize that it's a very slow, gradual process of integration and healing, and an acceptance of what is and what can be. And this is where we also need to acknowledge that since the love was real, the grieving process also needs to be real, and it's never to be rushed. This is where I would like to talk about 3 processes that Anu already mentioned of the long-term grieving types. In this, the first one I talk about is complicated grief. I'll give it to you as an example or a set of examples. In complicated grief, the person experiences a major loss. Sometimes it's traumatic, and associated with that, they have a lot of complex emotions that they've not been able to process. Sometimes people going through complicated grief are wrongly diagnosed as people who have depression and are put on medication for depression and don't show improvement over a period of time. I can give you 2 examples. A very close friend of mine lost her husband in a very, very gruesome road accident. She herself was an athlete, and after this accident, she could not compete in any of her tournaments. The 2 levels of grief that she experienced, one of a loved one losing his life in the way he did, and 2, giving up on something so precious for her, which was her sport, led to a lot of complicated grief. She had a lot of negative thoughts. She was extremely pessimistic, was unable to wake up in the morning and face the day, and she struggled quite a lot for almost 2 years till we were able to diagnose the complicated grief and help her through it. But it need not be something so difficult or something so challenging. In my case, and Anu has sat with me processing that complicated grief after 19 years of it having happened. So when I was in college, the Senate elections, which were very, very, very important, happened, and for some reason, the entire college sat against me on strike, and I was rejected by 800 people sitting down in the drive in my college, and supported by several professors as well. I had trusted some people and had shared information with them about the elections, and they went on to betray me. As a 19-year-old, when I was rejected by an entire set of peers, it was such a painful experience for me, and it became complicated grief. It was diagnosed as depression, and my therapist had asked me to go on medication, but when I realized, and I moved on to Delhi, and I started studying, and I started doing a course that I really enjoyed, which was psychology and working with children, I was able to overcome the complicated grief. In fact, 19 years later, Anu and I sat on the same stone bench that I sat on in college when everybody was standing against me in a strike. And Anu and I sort of processed that grief together, which is why I thought it was significant to share it in this segment. The second kind of grief that is very difficult is what we call chronic grief. In chronic grief, I can give you an example of a lady who was married to the same person. In that generation, it was very common, to a person for 50 years. And after he passed away, she was also quite old by that time, she started becoming very anxious about her own health and the fact that she did not have anyone to support her because she did not have children. So in this, what she started doing was restricting herself from going out, restricting herself from meeting people. And this slowly started becoming dementia for her, because she no longer had a social support structure. She no longer had her loved one, and she lived in extreme fear. And towards the end of her life, she was diagnosed with dementia, and the onset probably was because of chronic grief, the inability to deal with the loss of the loved one, and an increase in the amount of fear and anxiety that she started experiencing. The third type of long-term grief that I would like to share with you is what we call compounded grief. Compounded grief, I can give you the example of a lady who was born in a family where there was a lot of mental illness. She was a very strong person. So since her mother had schizophrenia when this girl was just about 10 years old, she was used to taking care of her mother who was very ill. She used to take care of all the household chores. She was in fact the mother for the family, taking care of her younger siblings as well. She also took care of a brother she was very, very fond of. And then later on, her mother passed away when she was about 14 or 15 years old. She didn't grieve because she had to take care of the rest of the family. And later on, when she was about 30, 35 years old, her own younger brother was dumped by his wife, and he immediately ended his life on a drug overdose. This was something that she was not able to deal with. Now, she did not grieve there. She immediately went on to a mode where she took care of her nephews and nieces, the children of her brother that she decided to take care of. Recently, she tested COVID positive, and at that point, apart from her physical symptoms and the inability to take care of herself, all of this grief, right from having to lose her childhood to taking care of her mother, losing her mother, brother's family, all of these complex things that she never grieved all these years came up together, and she started experiencing extreme crying and extreme distress, and it reduced her functioning. Though the doctors attributed it only to the COVID, when we started working with her in the counseling process, we noticed that it was compounded grief. So these are all examples of long-term processes or types of grief that some people experience because they've not grieved at a particular point in time.
And COVID has also brought with it a collective grief. The grief that all of us felt when we heard about what was happening in the country, the shortage of oxygen, the critical shortage of beds, and the lack of medicines, the shortage of vaccines. And this is something that we all feel together. We feel this as a collective grief. And then there is secondary grief. In secondary grief, we're talking about a grief that comes tagging along with the primary one. The first one is, say, maybe a job loss. But as a result of that, losing touch with friends, losing touch with family, having to relocate, all of this is secondary grief.
During the pandemic, some people unfortunately have had to also cope with cumulative grief. In cumulative grief, what happens is, by the time I process one loss, I have a series of losses, and I'm not able to deal with the emotional fallout of each one of these. This is typical of people who lost several loved ones because of the illness. Another type of grief that I've had to help a lot of people through is what we call disenfranchised grief, which is technically grief that is not socially acceptable. For example, grieving the death of an ex in spite of being separated for more than 4 or 5 years, or grieving an extramarital affair because nobody understands that you were in an extramarital affair. Or, for example, somebody who is gay but has not yet come out to the family, losing an intimate partner and telling the family that they have had a breakup with a friend. The family usually doesn't understand why the breakup with a friend is so severe. This is disenfranchised grief. The loss of a pet sometimes is also disenfranchised grief, and one of the more common forms of disenfranchised grief is when there is a miscarriage and the lady who's been pregnant is grieving the fetus that was unborn. So these are all types of grief that are sometimes very, very difficult to process just because of the nature of the severity, the chronicity, and also because they are not socially acceptable.
My heart goes out to every one of you as you understand that what you are going through might be a form of grief. And it could even be because you are not able to socialize or meet friends, or that you're not able to travel. And Aarti and I would like to present to you a model that might help you cope with it. As we said before, grief is not something that needs to be treated or fixed. It is something that has to be held and processed, the emotions, the loss, and you have to go through this whole thing as a journey. One of the earliest models that was brought into the therapeutic world was one of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She spoke about grief going through a process which was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. But then grief and the process of it is not really a linear process, nor is it time bound. As I discovered in my own case, I didn't go through these stages. And for me, grief came in waves, and it was very different from the model that was prescribed. And that's when I knew that there must be more ways to process grief?
There are many models of processing grief. What you mentioned is one, but Dr. Warden talks about grief as a set of tasks, the grief process being a set of tasks, starting with the acceptance of the reality of the loss. The second step or the second task that he suggests that we should indulge in is to work through the pain and the grief very, very gradually. The third task that is suggested is that we adjust to life without the person or without the job or whatever we have lost. The fourth is to be able to maintain a connection with the deceased person or to retain the lessons of the loss and to start rebuilding life. So when grief is looked at as a set of tasks instead of stages, some people resonate better with it.
And Aarti and I, being the practical people that we are, would choose tasks. Don't you agree?
Yes, but I also believe that people usually oscillate between the loss orientation and the restoration orientation. And what is the difference between the two? When I connect to the loss orientation, I'm usually crying, I'm yearning for the person, I experience a lot of denial or sadness, and there is a lot of anger associated with it, and I avoid any kind of problem solving or restoration. However, when I'm in the restoration orientation, I look at problem solving, where I look at how to manage the challenges, how to move on, and how to restore my functioning. So in the normal grieving process, people will keep oscillating between the loss orientation and the restoration orientation, and that's quite normal.
If it's oscillation, then the example is right now here before you. As I record about coping with grief, I cannot help but remember what I felt when I lost Appa. And I'm oscillating between experience that grief and then carrying on and recording this for the people that it might help. And another example could be people making changes to their expenditures post a job loss, but at the same time grieving about not having enough.
As you can see, each one of us makes sense of loss in the way we can. We need to just remember to take small steps as often as we can and process it with as much self-compassion as we can, knowing that some days will be more challenging than the others and some days will be extremely productive. We may not necessarily go through a very linear process. It would be cyclical, where we build into our resources and we will also break down certain things. So we need to understand that regressing during the process of grief and going back to square one is also possible.
Grief is never time bound, and bouncing back does not mean that we forget and move on. We have to process it and make peace with the loss and ourselves. And many people don't do that. Grief is a very individual and personal journey that all of us have to make. It's not just dealing with the sadness. It is understanding and processing so many thoughts and memories and emotions and trying to make sense of it.
This is where, as a therapist, I normally help people who are going through the challenges of a grieving process to experience two kinds of grieving. The first one is what we call instrumental grieving. Instrumental grieving is where we help the person to minimize and regulate emotional experience and look for actual solutions to problems or challenges in their life. In a way, it helps them to restore functioning. The second type of grieving that I usually help them through is what we call intuitive grieving. In intuitive grieving, we allow a heightened emotional experience to be expressed in a safe space, usually in the therapeutic setting. And in this, we also resolve and work through emotions that the person finds very difficult or has not had the courage or the ability to deal with in the past. And in this intuitive grieving process, there is a lot of catharsis. How do we decide whether to do something instrumentally or intuitively is largely dependent on the needs of the person who's going through the grieving process, and more importantly, trusting their own wisdom, knowing that they know best what they need to go through. My role as the therapist is only to facilitate whatever is best for them.
That's really beautiful, and I can relate to that. When you speak about instrumental grieving and intuitive grieving, I went through that when I lost Amma and Appa, because The instrumental grieving, I think you could say, when I gave away Amma's walker to the old age home and a lot of her things. And also when I set up a bench for my dad to honor his memory, we had such a beautiful inscription on it as well. So these, I think, would come under instrumental grieving. But I also went through phases where I allowed myself to feel the emotions. And not easy.
In the grief process, we've been often told that strength is in curtailing emotion. Stay strong, don't break down, we've been told. But we need to understand that expression is empowerment. And in this, we need to also know that every honest emotion that we feel will be positive. And so, it's good to express what we feel. The best way to do it, of course, is to sit with a supportive friend or a non-judgmental family member, or if you need to work with a counselor or a therapist, that's also fine. Some people find solace in journaling or in exploring new hobbies like art, music, or even through movement and dance, because it facilitates some of the pre-verbal emotions that we may not be able to verbalize or use or to express through words. By saying this, I also would like you to understand that when we express and work through the narrative, explore what the loss meant to us, and also specifically work with every emotion that is triggered during the grief process, we access vulnerable parts of us that we are not able to otherwise work through. So it's extremely important to understand that the grief process will remove some of our emotional blocks and keep us open to emotional vulnerabilities.
But you know what? That vulnerability actually helps. Grief made me a bit more caring and empathetic towards other people, kinder. I've always been a very strong person who has followed my dreams and done whatever I wanted to do despite expectations, be it from family or society. But after the loss of my parents, which is, I think, one of the most defining moments of my life and the most transformational period in my life, I realized that I found the courage to be vulnerable. I found the courage to share the gentler parts of myself, and by doing so, I was able to relate to the gentler and vulnerable parts of other people as well.
Yes, that's because grief is an acceptance of our vulnerabilities, an awareness and a gentle expression of our emotions, including the ones we are most afraid to express. And it is a process of growing through the crisis first, dealing with the smaller challenges, and then embracing the lessons and the memories. Evidence-based practices usually focus on, first, facilitating healthy expression, working through the narrative or whatever it works best for you, exploring what the loss meant to you, what the person or the job or whatever you lost means to you, finding ways to regulate unpleasant emotions, especially the ones that cause you a lot of distress. Then you work on processing unresolved issues associated with the loss, and then finding a way to move on while integrating the growth that was brought on by the loss.
And while we are speaking about this, I would like to share with you what, in my experience, did and didn't help. People said a lot of things, they did a lot of things, and a lot of it helped and a lot of it didn't. So let me tell you what didn't help. Judgmental and controlling statements didn't help. When people said, be strong, this is fate. If they had done this, they would not have passed away. Or if you had done this, they would have not have died. Why are you still crying? They wouldn't want you to cry. You know, when they made all these statements, it didn't feel comforting to me. It felt as if they were uncomfortable about, they were hiding their discomfort about dealing with someone who was mourning. And then there were the things that people said and did that did help me. The simplest thing was, I'm so sorry for your loss. The second thing that you could possibly say, and that helped me, was Aarti actually said this to me. And she said, I'm here if you want to talk. If you want to sit in silence, I'm here. And then there were the friends who offered to bring me food and just do these small things to remind me that I am in their thoughts. Because in the immediacy of grief, people are there. But as time goes by, people forget and they move on with life. And they were the friends who stood by me, who continued to help me as I continued processing the grief. And there were also the people who said, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, but tell me what I can do to help. These are the things that are not judgmental or controlling, and these are the kind of statements and actions that helped me when I was mourning and when I was going through grief. Oh, and yes, I admit you need the strength, but instead of saying be strong, I think a nicer way to say it would be I wish you strength during these difficult times.
Most people deal with grief with the support of a family member or a friend who is non-judgmental. Many people even manage to work through grief alone because they like to work in solitude. However, there are some others who may require professional support. Reach out to a grief counselor if you have extreme sleep disturbances, if you find yourself socially isolated and without any social support, and when the roles and transitions following the loss are extremely overwhelming. For example, you lose a loved one, you need to relocate to another city, you have to take care of the children, and you also need to find a new job. All of this suddenly seems overwhelming. The counselor will be able to help you access solutions and also to be able to regulate your emotions. Reach out to a grief therapist if there is a family history of mental illness, if you've already had a history of addictions, if you've already had to deal with depression and anxiety and were undergoing treatment, because grief triggers and worsens many of these conditions. You need to also reach out to a grief therapist if you have intrusive thoughts that you're not able to regulate, and if you're constantly reliving trauma and the yearning for the loved one that you may have lost is extreme and you're not able to remain functional. You reach out for immediate help. You could reach out to your family physician, a counselor, a psychiatrist, or to a helpline when you find yourself with suicidal ideations. I know that some of you find grief very overwhelming, that ending your own life seems like an option. But believe me, reach out immediately because we are all here to support you and we'd like you to feel better soon. The other time that you reach out for immediate help, and this would be for somebody that you know, if you notice that there is hallucination or they're having extreme distress, the red flag for reaching out for professional help will be prolonged or marked functional impairment.
And here are some points that we would like to reiterate. Grief is not something that you can fix. You learn to grow through grief. Many complex emotions are processed in the grief process. Be patient and know that the process does not have a fixed time or pace. It's an individual journey. It does not matter if you want to look at a model of stages or tasks. What matters is that every time there is a discomfort, don't distract yourself with social media, binge watching, video games, or gossip. Try and sit with the discomfort. And as you slowly allow expression without building a narrative of pity but one of acceptance, it becomes easier to tide over the difficult days. Special days like birthdays and anniversaries are often harder to deal with. It's okay to not feel okay as long as you're able to bounce back. If you are unable to make it on your own, please reach for help within your circle or for professional help depending on the kind of support that you need.
So I hope what Anu and I have put together for you is useful, and I hope you're able to cope with the loss and grow through the process.
Usually when I finish my videos, I remind you to keep your life sunny side up, but that's not always possible, isn't it? Which is why I say believe in good and hang in there. We will get through this.